the guru of guru, Brian Michael Jenkins, the master teacher of counterterrorism. I'm so delighted to be with you. Welcome to Singapore. Let me introduce Brian Michael Jenkins. A legend in his lifetime, Brian founded and built the discipline of counterterrorism. He built the field and he shaped it. And how did he do it? Firstly, he was a soldier scholar. He served with the US Special Forces. And he's a strategist and a visionary. Brian is respected by 3 generations of national security professionals and counterterrorism specialists as the founding father of the counterterrorism discipline. So nearly 60 years ago, Brian defined the research domain of terrorism by collecting and analyzing the counterterrorism data. And before that, before terrorism became the global battlefield, we saw that he prepared the world. How did he do that? One is he advised world leaders. I recall his visit to Singapore where he met with Lee Kuan Yew. Second is that he built a prototype for future databases. For instance, many government agencies designed and developed their counterterrorism databases, including the US government databases, by looking at what he has done. And third is he mentored a generation of counterterrorism scholars, including Bruce Hoffman, who was my PhD supervisor. So, terrorism has become the defining geopolitical challenge in the 21st century. And 3 decades before Al-Qaeda attacked America's most iconic landmarks on 9/11, September 11th, 2001, Brian looked at the wave of terrorism that started in the world in 1968. There were plane hijackings in 68. 72, there were 2 pivotal events. One is the Lod Airport in Tel Aviv was attacked by the Japanese Red Army at the behest of the PFLP. And also he examined the attack on the Munich Olympics in 72. So I want to share with everyone here that with the internationalization of terrorism, the US took a number of measures, and Brian was very much behind the research that went into those measures. So I would like to ask you, Brian, if you can share with us your own contribution to that field and how you shaped it starting in 72.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for that over-generous introduction. In terms of starting the field, as you mentioned, I was a former soldier and in military service, had served in Latin America and in Southeast Asia. I had studied abroad, so by the time really I was back in the United States in 1972, I had spent 10 years traveling around the world. And during that time, it struck me that we were witnessing really the shape of a new domain of conflict. And it wasn't well defined, and it wasn't entirely well defined in my own mind. But that terrorism, and we use that term, that terrorism represented a new mode of conflict. And it was very different from the kinds of wars that the United States and NATO, for example, or the Soviet Union were preparing for. That was essentially a rerun of World War II with nuclear weapons. But at the same time, if you looked around the world, there were guerrilla groups, urban guerrilla groups, blowing up things, hijacking airlines, kidnapping diplomats. And it struck me that these are not isolated incidents, that these are really the pieces, the shards of a new dimension. And I attempted in a memorandum written in early 1972, before these two incidents that you mentioned, to define this new domain, to in a sense, I asserted that this was likely to increase, it was likely to become increasingly international. It could affect us and our allies in a variety of ways, and it raised a number of major policy challenges. And I didn't know what the answers were to those policy challenges, but at least I could catalog those. That memorandum went off to Washington, disappeared, like many memorandum in Washington do, until these two striking incidents that you mentioned took place. You mentioned the Lode Airport incident. And in that, as I recall, I think there were 26 who were killed and 80 or 80 some who were wounded in the attack. But that was not what caught people's attention. That attack, as you mentioned, was carried out by the Japanese Red Army in alliance with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It was carried out in Israel, and coincidentally, it turns out that most of the victims were Puerto Rican pilgrims visiting the Holy Land. And people ask themselves, how is it that Japanese come to Israel to kill Puerto Ricans on behalf of Palestinians? It was the international complexity of that really was new and baffling. And then, of course, the Olympic incident in Munich, in which members of a terrorist group took hostage the Israeli team, and it ended tragically with the deaths of all of the hostages. There were hundreds of millions of people watching that on television worldwide, and that was absolutely stunning. And so those two events acted as a catalyst for governments, not just the United States government, but governments around the world, to, in a sense, scratch their heads and say, what is this? In my particular case, in terms of how did I begin, somebody, in response to these incidents, in particular to the Munich incident, the President of the United States, 3 weeks later, created something called the Cabinet Committee to Combat Terrorism. It was simply an effort to bring together all of our activities, to get our act together, if you will. It was chaired by the Secretary of State. It had the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, the Attorney General, the FBI, and so on. And someone, I don't know who, one of the staff members came across this memorandum that I had written, and in a sense, hey, there's some guy out at the Rand Corporation, where I worked at the time. Why don't we ask them to begin research? And the Secretary of State, who chaired this committee, said, absolutely. And I was summoned to Washington, and they said, put together a team. They handed my own memorandum back to me and said, get going. And that was the beginnings of the research.
It is those acts of international terrorism that involved more than one nationality or more than one country that, in fact, made you create the first chronology of international terrorism, and gradually that evolved into the database on international terrorism. First, you build it at the Rand Corporation. Of course, many governments benefited from that. But later, when Paul Wilkinson and Bruce Hoffman established the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews, that database moved to St Andrews in Scotland, and I myself, as a PhD student, worked on that database with a US military officer called Eric Bray. Then we started to collect not only acts of international terrorism, but acts of national terrorism or domestic terrorism. So I want to express our appreciation to you. You not only build a database for the United States, but also you provided us the template and the inspiration to build one in the United Kingdom. And subsequently, when I moved to Singapore in 2002, we almost replicated the capability that you had created in the United States and later developed at St Andrews. I want to ask you how international cooperation, that is, cooperation between governments, started, particularly security and intelligence services, started when this wave of international terrorism hit the world. What were the pivotal events? I know that 9/11 certainly led to a different level of collaboration and partnership. But what kind of cooperation did you witness with the two incidents in 1972?
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of that question international terrorism, the chronology of international terrorism. And the operative word there is international. That is, these events were international either because these groups operating in their own country targeted foreign embassies, diplomats, or because in some cases they went abroad to carry out their attacks. So in the case of the Munich Olympics, terrorists came from the Middle East to attack Israelis in Germany. In the case of the Lod Airport massacre, Japanese went to Israel to attack targets there. And that was the focus of concern of the international community. In other words, the international community was not saying that, well, we are going to intervene in these various countries where these events are taking place to deal with their terrorist problem. That was a matter of national sovereignty. But what we are concerned about is that violence spilling over into the international community. And that has to stop, because what happened for example, in Latin America, in South America, the American ambassador to Brazil was kidnapped in 1969. That kidnapping set off a wave of kidnappings of diplomats in Uruguay, in Argentina, more kidnappings in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Mexico, Haiti. It spread over to Europe, and we saw kidnappings of diplomats in Europe. In 1968, there was a hijacking of an El Al plane by a Palestinian group. That prompted imitation abroad, and we saw planes being hijacked in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and so on. And so the international community said, okay, look, this type of activity has to stop. Now, if you're going to deal successfully with an international problem, an international phenomenon, it requires international cooperation. International cooperation requires consensus on the definition of the problem. And that wasn't easy. In part, our chronology was not only to give us facts. You know, when I first started the research, I was reading books about terrorism. I was reading speeches made by politicians about terror, that this was just, this type of violence. And most of this early public statements by public figures was polemical. And the terrorists were the people we oppose. They're the bad guys. And if you could have fixed the label terrorist to your opponents, that was provided you with some moral advantage. And so the idea behind the database was, all right, these are the kinds of events we are concerned about. We can categorize these, we can put them into a chronology. How do we address these specific events? In other words, take these out of the domain of politics and put it into the domain of international cooperation, of dealing with a specific problem. We could not achieve a sufficient consensus for any kind of international agreement to condemn or ensure international cooperation against terrorism. That was too broad. So instead, we adopted a tactic-by-tactic approach. We said, all right, put aside the issue of terrorism. We're not going to use this word in an international convention. Hijacking airliners. At that time, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, many countries, not just in the advanced countries, but in the global south, were creating their own national airlines. And we said, certainly we can find agreement that hijacking airliners is a mutual problem. Now, even to get that agreement took some compromise, because a number of the hijackings were from the former Soviet Union, carried out by people escaping oppression. But we had to say, all right, if we're going to condemn and prohibit airline hijacking, we cannot say, well, it will apply here but not apply there. And that led to an important aspect of the definition, which was reflected in the chronology and reflected in the diplomatic approach. Terrorism is defined by the quality of the act, not the identity of the perpetrator or the nature of the cause. So by focusing attention on the events, not on whether this cause is a valid cause, or this cause is just, or this cause is noble, focus on the event, let's deal with it. There was a convention against airline hijacking. Not surprisingly, we could get the world's diplomats to agree that diplomats ought not to be targets. They are protected by international treaties. Even in wartime, diplomats are protected. That's the only way you can have diplomacy. That was another treaty. Some of the activities carried out by terrorists, taking hostages, threatening hostages, were already prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. So we're saying, well, how can we allow someone to do something which we already have prohibited in international conventions? So there was a convention against the taking of hostages. It took 30 years, 3 decades, to get a corpus of international law that did not use the word terrorism, but collectively defined about 90% of what they did. And that became the basis for international cooperation, which was increasing bit by bit in the 20th century, but it really became the platform that allowed the United Nations to take vigorous international action after 9/11. So that provided the framework, the legal diplomatic framework for international cooperation, focusing on the event.
Brian, can you also explain how the threat changed and the context changed, the tactics changed from that early wave? Because we saw new groups emerging. We saw the Lebanese Hezbollah, we saw Al-Qaeda, we saw Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, we saw ISIS, then the Taliban, the Al-Shabaab. So many new groups emerged, and many of these groups are very militarized compared to that earlier wave that we witnessed in the late 60s and the early 70s.
Right.
So how did the threat change?
Well, the 1960s was a decade of social and political ferment. I mean, there was revolution in the air. The May Day riots in 1968 in Paris. The uprising in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. Waves of protest across the United States for peace, against the war, for civil liberties. The free speech movement at universities in the United States and Europe. Massive demonstrations against the government, protest movements in Japan and elsewhere. So this was the Cultural Revolution in China. This was an era of ferment. Most of these groups that took the field in that period of time were relatively small groups that were frustrated with the inability of these large-scale protests to achieve what they wanted to achieve. They were the most radicalized, they were the ultras, and they turned to violence. They turned to violence in the cities in Latin America because the attempts to replicate the success of Fidel Castro in Cuba, which inspired a number of rural guerrilla movements, had failed. There were still some surviving rural guerrillas, but they held remote pieces of jungle or mountaintops. And so they moved into the cities. In the Middle East, the Palestinians were frustrated by the failure of Arab military power, the Arab states, the Arab armies, to be able to defeat the armed forces of Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, and especially in the Six-Day War in 1967. And so both in frustration and as a recognition that if they were to keep their cause alive, they had to do it themselves, they began to use these violent tactics. And then in Europe and North America and in Asia, inspired by these groups in Latin America, these other groups then also took the field. And so there was a proliferation of small, ideologically motivated, secular groups. And that dominated the activities in the 1970s. By the late 1970s, the early 1980s, those groups had been, most of them, not all of them, had been eliminated or contained, although struggles continued in Northern Ireland, in Spain, and for a few more years in Germany and Italy. But that was on a downhill path. But in 1979, 3 spectacular events took place. One was the Iranian Revolution that led to the Islamic Republic. The second was the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by religious fanatics. And the third was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We didn't connect those 3 at the time, but in retrospect, looking at it from a historical point of view, that was a turning point. And that led to the emergence of groups that drew upon religion to create ideologies that justified violence. Now, I said that very carefully because I don't want to say that the religion was the driver of violence. One can find acts of violence in the, you know, in the Hebrew Bible, the Torah. One can find that. One can find it certainly in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament. One can find violence in the Quran, the chapters of the sword chapters. So, but it's not religion. It's people that created ideologies that use the religion as a justification for the violence, and that altered terrorism significantly. So let me back up. In the 1970s, I wrote, terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. And what I meant by that is that terrorism was aimed at a target audience. The violence inflicted on the actual victims was almost irrelevant. And these groups that carried out terrorist attacks, they actually operated under certain self-constraints. Now, their acts were dreadful, but there were self-imposed constraints. That they had a curious notion of violence that sort of is like the volume control on a television set, you know, turn it up a little louder and so on, that you could kind of finely calibrate the level of violence. There were risks in going too far, because if you went too far, you could alienate your perceived constituents. And these groups imagine themselves, they have legions of supporters. And if you went too far, you could provide an excuse for an extreme government crackdown. So there were risks. So every terrorist organization had its own red lines. Now, they weren't all the same. They were different. And they weren't immutable. They changed over time. But there was the notion of self-imposed constraints. Because these were secular groups, they thought like politicians. You worry about constituency. When you move into the realm of an ideology drawn from religion, when you're doing this, when you're doing this in the name of faith, who is your constituent? Your constituent is God. You have one constituent, and you do things to please God. And that, in a sense, removes any secular earthly constraints. And what we saw was an escalation in the violence because the mindset had changed. And this is important because one of the major transformations that we saw in the 1970s, the Road Airport massacre, 26 dead. If you go up in the 70s, the worst incidents in terms of fatalities of terrorism were measured in the tens. In the 1980s, the worst incidents of terrorism were measured in the hundreds of fatalities. In the 1990s, the upper register remained in the hundreds, but the number of incidents in the hundreds increased in volume. On 9/11, we crossed into the thousands. So in a period of 30 years, this was an increase of 2 orders of magnitude, 10 to 100 to 1,000. And the anticipation was, post 9/11, that we would be looking at future incidents with casualties in the tens of thousands or potentially hundreds of thousands. And so fundamental change. The other, I think, major trends that we saw in terrorism over the years, continuing through the 9/11 attacks and post 9/11 environment, was obviously there was almost instantaneous global diffusion of terrorist tactics because of communications, and then because of instruction, indirect and direct instruction, and through imitation and so on. So a tactic that appeared somewhere as a success would then begin to be imitated worldwide. Another trend, as I mentioned already, was vertical escalation. We saw that. Post 9/11, we saw horizontal escalation. I'll come back to that. Come back to that point. And so, yes, the phenomenon itself was constantly evolving, and therefore, how it was viewed as a problem, a policy issue, also was evolving.
You explained that the wave of terrorism in Latin America had an impact in influencing the wave of terrorism in the Middle East. You specifically referred to, I think, also linked with George Habash's group. Would you be kind to share that with the audience?
Well, to be sure, these various struggles taking place. Now, again, let's back up for a moment historically, because there's some key events. In 1966, in Havana, a major conference took place called the Tricontinental Conference. And this brought together revolutionaries, freedom fighters, guerrilla groups from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, worldwide. Actually, it was thought of primarily as a global South movement, but in fact, it was a global movement. This, in a sense, was the, and I don't mean to be I don't mean to be humorous about this, but this was the I don't know, the Cannes Film Festival of Revolution. It had a red carpet just about on it. At any rate, there were exchanges of views. There was a notion of international solidarity. So these groups began to watch each other. And George Habash certainly saw what was going on in Latin America, and he thought, how can we use this? There was another source of influence, and that is, at one time, George Habash spoke about, in a sense, attempting to turn the Palestinian movement into the equivalent of the Viet Cong. He said, but we need a powerful Arab country neighbor that will provide the base of support for a guerrilla war in Israel. Another source, which was extremely important to the movement, was the FLN in Algeria, which had fought France from 1954 to 1962, gaining Algerian independence. But the takeaway that they learned from that, or thought that they learned, was that the Algerians' terrorism was a big factor in their struggle. I should point out, terror was a big factor in the French suppression of that struggle in Algeria, but also the notion of carrying that struggle into the metropole of France. Palestinians looking at the world, who is the metropole of Israel? What's the metropole of Israel? It is the countries that support Israel. It is Israelis worldwide, Israeli diplomats. It is Jews worldwide. It is plane loads of people coming to Israel as tourists for whatever reasons. And so that, in a sense, propelled them into the international domain. They could not operate effectively inside Israel, but they could operate effectively internationally. And so we're back into the international domain.
Can you share with us who were your contemporaries? I know that one of the first books I read on terrorism was by Paul Wilkinson. He wrote Terrorism and the Liberal State. I read it in the mid 1980s. Of course, 10 years after that, I went to St. Andrews and I served as his teaching assistant. You also met with Gerard Chalion, a counterinsurgency specialist who believed in going and staying with the guerrillas and learning from them. He called it participant observation, and he also wrote a number of books. Then there was a man I didn't meet, but I believe you may have met him, Boyer Bell. Then, of course, there were other very distinguished scholars, Martha Crenshaw, Alex Schmidt, and others. Would you be kind to share with us whether any of them were your contemporaries and whom did you interact and discuss these issues?
They were all of the people you named were my contemporaries, and I had the privilege of interacting with all of them. And I shouldn't use the past tense. Martha Crenshaw, Alex Schmidt are still very active writing about this. And I mentioned the Algerians. I mean, that was Martha Crenshaw's contribution, her field, writing about the Algerian struggle. You mentioned Paul Wilkinson, a very dear friend of mine. And when he wrote Terrorism in a Liberal State, he and I actually were moving parallel on the same thoughts, and that is, what is the challenge here beyond international conventions, beyond tactics, beyond security measures? And we both we shared the same concern, and that is the effects of terrorism, the consequences of terrorism, beyond the casualties, beyond the destruction, the effects on a democratic state. And the concern that in measures to combat terrorism, in a response to the terror and fear and alarm that terrorists were trying to create, states would overreact. And that would ultimately, the greatest threat posed is that it would corrode democracy. In fact, in something I wrote at the same time, in 1974, I wrote that, and I'm not going to get the words exactly right because it was years ago, but because of changes in technology, because of changes in tactics, because of changes in circumstances, power, and power defined crudely as simply the capacity to kill, to destroy, to disrupt, to create fear and alarm, to compel us to devote vast resources to security, that power was descending into the hands of groups whose grievances, real or imaginary, it was not going to be possible to satisfy. And how can we, as democracies, effectively deal with that and remain democracies? Now, that question is still very much before us. That hasn't gone away. That remains today with even ever increasing potential power of disruption and larger terrorist organizations capable of local and global operations and grievances when we get beyond ideologies that can be understood in terms of Marxism or other ideologies or ideologies drawn from religion. We now have individuals who, in a sense, shop for ideologies, that ideologies are nothing more than a conveyor for their personal discontents. And how do we deal with that? I mean, whether we're talking about incel or replacement theories or nihilist tendencies or people who even will make ethical arguments in favor of wiping out the population omnicide because it is necessary to save the planet. And so those are not easily dealt with in a normal political discourse. And yet they move people to mass violence. We have mass murders with manifestos.
Terrorism doesn't come by the misinterpretation only of one faith. For example, there are Buddhist people who use Buddhism and conduct terrorist attacks. There are Hindus who do that. There are also Sikhs who use their religion to do attacks. There are Christians and Jews also. So one of the most brutal terrorist attacks that I witnessed was in 2019. Brenton Tarrant from Australia, he he was from Brisbane, and he went and attacked two Islamic centers in New Zealand, and he killed a lot of people. So the right-wing extremism is also one of the greatest challenges. We also discussed about the attack in Oklahoma, where the P. Alfred Murrah building was attacked. So what can you say about these other ideologies of terrorism that has affected the world? Do you think right-wing extremism and terrorism will rise, especially in the Western countries, in the coming years?
I'm very careful with predictions, and I'm not internationally recognized in the field of prophecy, but you mentioned Tarrant and his attack. This is an example of the type of individual I'm talking about. And is there an underlying ideology in this? Yes, but I mean, what Tarrant was doing is, this has become almost gamified in the sense that individuals, often very troubled individuals, will embrace an ideology because it resonates and provides, in a sense, a justification for already aggressive tendencies. And so there was, prior to the attack in New Zealand, there was Breivik's attack in Oslo, Norway. And because of that attack, he became really an icon in this curious domain of recognized a celebrity killer. And then Tarrant came along, and what we have, in a sense, is almost a competition, as if it were a video game, for body count by individuals who are, in some cases, they may leave a last will and testament that explains what they're doing, and it may reflect something on the far left. It may reflect something on the far right. In some cases, they carry out a mass killing, and we still can't figure out why. And this makes it very, very difficult because we scratch our heads on this. Are we dealing with a type of a clinical problem here, a kind of madness? Are we dealing with an ideological problem? Is this some kind of cunning, leaderless resistance to inspire people to act? Are these merely individuals who are shopping the ideologies? And some of them can switch. I mean, we had in the United States, we had a young man who was a member of the Atomwaffen SS, a right-wing neo-Nazi group. But one day, he converted and he became a Muslim. And we don't quite know what this means when he says himself, he converted. Did he buy a Quran and read it? Did he buy a rug? This is a bit of a mystery in terms of, he converted. And then, because he now had converted from this one ideology to the embracing of another extreme ideology, not just, I'm not talking about the Quran, but an extreme form, he attacked his comrades because they were dissing, they were disparaging Muslims. Now, there's a book written many, many years ago by a man named Eric Hoffer called The True Believer. And he said there is a personality type that whatever they believe in fervently. And they can switch ideologies, but the constant is the fervency. And we're seeing that in the violence now. We're seeing increasing stabbings and shootings and other violence carried out by young teenagers who radicalize themselves very, very fast. And you ask the question, do we have someone who has been converted and radicalized, self-radicalized? Or do we have an adolescent with a lot of problems? And it's very, very difficult to deal with because it is also changing how we are compelled to analyze this. So I mentioned earlier that the focus was on the event, because that was what we wanted to prevent from happening in an international environment where it could create international crises, it could cause war. We then, because of these groups, gained more power and actually had to be confronted directly. We changed the focus to going after the terrorist groups, and we had formally designated terrorist organizations that were subjected to sanctions and that allowed authorities in some cases to take actions because they were dealing with dangerous organized groups. So it went from event to group. But then, as we saw in these later developments where terrorist organizations were recruiting through exhortation, and those joining, it was unlike joining a group in the 1970s when you joined a small clandestine group which would carefully vet volunteers to make sure that they weren't infiltrators and that they were reliable. Instead, you self-radicalized, declared yourself a warrior, and went in. So this brought us into an area where you yourself, Rohan, have been most active, and that is in the area of de-radicalization and rehabilitation. And of course, that leads to what you learn from de-radicalization, you attempt to use in prevention of radicalization. But now, what is our unit of analysis here? It's the individual. And so that's where we have been concentrating. I think, not to say that any of these previous issues are now irrelevant, we still focus on those. But we are now looking at some of these events, like these random killers. And by the way, we are seeing in Europe, in North America, in other places, we are seeing a dramatic increase in random social aggression. Not ideologically driven insofar as we can tell, just people on edge, ready to violence. Are these things telling us, are these the, in a sense, canaries in a coal mine that are warning us something about our society? Have our societies become so stressed or depressed or angry, on edge, that they are ready to violence? I don't know the answer to that question, But that is an area where we are looking right now. So as terrorism has evolved, it has obliged the analysts to address it in different ways. It's still a phenomenon, but you simply change the lens through which you examine the problem, because that seems the way to deal with it. That's one thing interesting about most terrorism research. Most terrorism research is unlike, for example, a lot of history is written for the sake of history. And it's fun to read and it's interesting to read. It may have lessons in it. But really the vast majority of terrorism research is policy oriented, it's pragmatic, it's aimed at solving a problem. It's aimed at preventing violence, responding to violence, avoiding that violence from undermining democracy, changing society. And so, yes, terrorism was, I thought, an intellectual challenge, a major challenge when I started in the early 1970s, late 60s. But today, it remains a major challenge in our society.
Yesterday, you visited the Rehabilitation Center of Terrorists and Extremists in Singapore, and you had a 3-hour session there. You met with Ustaz Professor Muhammad bin Ali, who is the co-chairman. You also met with Ustaz Dr. Faisal. You also met with Ustaz Dr. Sabaria Hussein. And you also met with Chegu Salim. They were all my students. And now they are leading in the field of rehabilitation, because we believe that rehabilitation is the game changer in the fight against extremism and terrorism, because there are a lot of distortions of the faith by various politically motivated people. I want to ask from you how we can reduce the threat of politically motivated violence at a global level. What is your advice to governments, and what is your advice to government partners that are determined to reduce the threat of violence and extremism?
Great question, and I'm tempted to avoid it. Sometimes people will say, "Gee, Brian, you've been working on terrorism for more than 50 years, And my answer is, yes, give me another 50 years and I'll have it all sorted out. And so I really have to remain humble in that. What is taking place here? We have a problem, we have an issue that, terrorist tactics date back centuries. They go back to, you can find, we didn't use the label, but you can find examples in the most ancient times. But contemporary terrorism, in the way we see it evolving today, as you pointed out at the beginning, began in the late 1960s or early 1970s. We have now been battling that for just about 60 years. We have managed to destroy some terrorist organizations. We managed to degrade the capabilities. We have improved our intelligence and are able to thwart attacks. And so we've had our successes, but we haven't eliminated this problem. And perhaps we ought not to look at it in terms that, someday we're going to be able to say, no more terrorism, this is the end of the story. I don't think we're going to get there. And perhaps we ought to view this as more akin to a law enforcement problem, more equivalent to a deep social problem. I'm not dismissing law enforcement. I'm not dismissing when it's absolutely necessary, the application of military power. But we know that, yes, can we kill terrorist leaders? Yes, we've done so. Killed a lot of them. And the groups are still there. So, we have to accept that either one, these are very long wars, and we have to think in terms of, it's beyond the 30 Years' War. I mean, we're looking at more something like the 100 Years' War, where conflict went on between the French and English kings for 100 years. Either we have to accept forever wars, or we have to say, no, this is not a finite thing. This is not a beginning and an end. This reflects how our society evolves. It reflects technological developments, just as terrorism did at the beginning. It was not only a reflection of political circumstances, it was a reflection of technological developments. One, modern aviation not only provided terrorists with worldwide mobility, but with a convenient set of targets, nationally labeled. More important, television. In 1968, we began deploying communication satellites with uplinks, which made it possible to broadcast almost instantaneously live coverage of unfolding terrorist events. We saw this in Munich. And that capability has increased even more, to the point that now with technology, as I mentioned, we have the killers themselves wearing GoPro cameras to record it and live stream it. So technological developments were critical. One of the developments that facilitated contemporary terrorism in the 1970s was simply the proliferation of small arms. I'm not talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles. I'm talking about the proliferation of AK-47s and just small arms. Now, interestingly enough, years ago, it was in the late 1970s, we conducted a research project to identify all of the weapons that were entering the arsenals of armies, to try to select which ones of those might be acquired and utilized by terrorists. One of the things very much of concern at the time, continues to be, was shoulder fire, that is handheld, precision guided, surface to air missiles, which would enable an individual to bring down a commercial airliner landing or taking off from an airport. So we looked at a number of these. We missed the most important one, the internet. Now, to give ourselves some excuse, the internet was then in its infancy, and we didn't anticipate how it would develop. But probably the internet has had a more profound impact on the conduct of terrorism than anything else we've seen. The ability to communicate, the ability to spread propaganda, the ability to recruit remotely, to inspire groups, and even beyond that with social media, the ability to create, reach out to people and select them and incite them to violence, or the creation of online communities so that somebody who has some particular ideology will very, very quickly find like-minded individual to reinforce their extremism. So technology, we're just looking at AI. Now, AI is artificial intelligence. It certainly is going to be used, is already being used, in terms of to create cyber attacks and things of that sort, to help in attacks. That's a modest use of it. Will we see attacks that will actually combine real-time, combine kinetic power, that is application of physical violence, and in a sense, the AI to amplify, disrupt at the same time, so you get a reinforcing effect of the two. That's a more sophisticated application. We haven't quite seen that. We haven't seen that yet, but it's on a path. Even without the direct effects, I read that people are saying AI is going to change society, the basic economics of our society, as profoundly as the Industrial Revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution that contributed to the revolts in Europe in the 19th century, that led to the emergence of anarchist violence in the late 19th century, and indeed exacerbated in another way, that led to the class warfare tensions, that led to the Marxist revolutions of the early 20th century. Now, somebody says that to me, we are going to see that kind of profound change. First question is, are our governments prepared to deal with that? And not a matter of regulating AI, are we prepared to deal with the consequences of this new technology? And so if we're already struggling with the algorithms of the internet, with the reach of social media, with GoPro cameras, and now add to that AI, clearly, the one thing that we can expect is that there will be individuals that will exploit that in terms of violence, of violence. And again, back to my statement that I wrote many, many years ago. And how will we deal with that in a democratic society and remain democratic societies?
I want to express my appreciation to Brian Michael Jenkins for sharing his insights, for sharing a part of his history with us. I also want to say that he's a far-reaching leader with an indomitable spirit. He has contributed 40, 50 years of his life for the study of national security and counterterrorism. And I want to say that you have contributed to building 4 generations of national security professionals and counterterrorism professionals. You are the first generation, the pioneer generation. Bruce Hoffman, second generation. I belong to the third generation, and now we have a fourth and a fifth generation. In fact, your fourth generation included General Tito Karnavian, who is currently the Minister of Home Affairs. I supervised his PhD. You met with him in the Middle East not too long ago. And Tito was counterterrorism chief of Indonesia, then police chief, now home minister. And now we are witnessing another generation. So your time on earth, you have spent it very beautifully and very productively, because terrorism harms civilians, and that is what you have tried to prevent. So future generations of scholars and practitioners will live in debt and in gratitude to you.
That, thank you very much again for the very kind compliments. My momentary alarm here is it sounds as if I'm finished. And the fact is, there is so much to be done. I mean, I tell people I've pushed my retirement age back to 120 because we have a lot to do. However, at the same time, you mentioned, the fourth and even the fifth generation that have been working on this. Even in this recent meetings that we've had here in Singapore, it is I am learning so much from them and how they are approaching it, and how sophisticated this field has become, and the quality of knowledge that, I can go back to think about. You mentioned our chronology. It wasn't computerized. It was on 3x5 cards and long wooden boxes that we wrote on. And when you look at that and look at where we are now, it is an extraordinary evolution of the field. And yet, at the same time, I recognize the magnitude of the challenge. And there is so much to do. And part of that challenge today is the fact that there is some sliding away from a notion that this is an appropriate, valid line of inquiry. We're again sliding into the notion that, well, if the cause is good, kidnapping, beheading, blowing up innocent people is justified. And I'm not saying that violence can be abolished, and I'm not a pacifist again. But the kind of violence, the massacre of civilians, the deaths of small children, and this, it is something that we are obliged to combat, and also because it can, in insidious ways, destroy the very democratic and norms and liberty that we believe in. And I wrote an essay about this some time ago called An Incremental Tyranny. And the argument of that was not that the terrorists will take over, or that there will be a military coup that will bring in a tyrannical government. I said that democracies eat themselves in small bites, and that the measures that we think that seem appropriate at the time may be appropriate at the time, but as they accumulate over time, they gradually change the atmosphere. We have to be mindful of that. That's something we want to prevent. And at the same time, we cannot see society sink into a violent, angry society where, it's a danger to be in a public place because of some bizarre ideology or some mad killer. That is something to fight for, and that is something that you and all of your colleagues here working on rehabilitation, de-radicalization, that all of these scholars are in effect on the front line, just as much as any soldiers were in previous modes of warfare.
Today you were hosted for lunch by Benny Lim, the architect of Singapore's security. And Benny Lim expressed appreciation to you for coming to Singapore over the years and engaging our colleagues, and also sharing your insights and your expertise over many years. And I want to thank you on behalf of the counterterrorism community of Singapore and beyond for your contribution to the stability and security of the world. I thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me here and allowing me to learn from you.
Thank you.